Okay, sure. So thanks again for putting us on the program. So this is joint work with Matt Wiswall, and we're going to talk about the role of expectations in human capital investments. So I think the traditional view of human capital investments has been to focus on career considerations, the monetary considerations. But of course, many of the factors could also be important in the choice of human capital decisions, such as future family life. People here already know this, marriage and fertility, the pure enjoyment of working in a certain field, the non-pecuniary factors, and so on. And the way I think most of the literature has focused on the trade-offs between career and family has been by looking at, for example, characteristics of people who have chosen certain jobs and certain levels of education. So, for example, the fact that in the data when you look, that women tend to be in careers where there's more flexibility, for example, from that they infer that, okay, it must be that women have a greater preference for work flexibility. So it's usually from revealed choices that we try to back out the preferences and try to understand how these decisions were made. In this paper, what instead we're going to do is we're going to look at how individuals, specifically students, when they're in the process of making these human capital investments, these decisions, how do they perceive the trade-off between career and family when they're young and when they're in the process of making these decisions. And what we'll argue is that actually it's the perceptions or beliefs about the future and not the realized outcomes which are really crucial in understanding decision-making. And hopefully it will become clear why that is. I'll show you some conceptual framework shortly. And then I think given that we know that individuals are making these decisions when they're young, they don't have full information, there's reason to believe that there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in their beliefs, and that also it's not necessarily the case that their beliefs are going to be consistent with rational expectations. And I think we are at the point now where there is enough evidence out there where people have collected a lot of these subjective expectations data, for example, about earnings, conditional on human capital investment levels, or about other aspects. But especially in the education literature, you see a lot more papers, and there you see that there's a lot of heterogeneity in students' perceptions and expectations, which cast doubt on the assumptions that we have to otherwise make to estimate these models.
Could you say, is there any of those data that is incentivized and that we have?
That is incentivized? Right. So this is going to be different from the experimental literature where everything tends to be incentivized. The reason is, so this is just going to be survey data. It's hard to incentivize people because we're going to be asking people about like this literature, and what we're also going to do, we're going to ask them about, for example, what their earnings would be given a certain level of human capital, certain level, say, if they were to go to college, what their earnings would be at some future point in time. You wouldn't observe those outcomes for 10, 15 years.
No, I fully understand, but we have no basis for testing if these are reasonable beliefs or bad beliefs or good beliefs. It's just prayer.
So no. So what we need here for these beliefs that they're reporting to be their true beliefs. They can be totally crazy beliefs. As long as they're acting on those beliefs, those are the ones which are relevant in explaining the decision. I
understand, but we have no basis in theory for knowing that these are the beliefs that they act on. That's all I'm trying to get at.
Oh, so no, I'll show you that these beliefs are going to be predictive of their intended choice. And there's I wouldn't say a large literature, but there's ample evidence that these beliefs tend to be predictive of actual behavior. Okay, sure. Okay. So just to quickly go over the conceptual framework. So the idea is that individuals at a given time, they have to choose a certain level of human capital, and they get some expected utility from, let's say, human capital level K, and that's just going to be a discounted sum of expected utility. Okay, so here there's a vector of future events. You can think of things like labor market participation, future earnings, spousal quality, and so on. So this is the mapping from that finite set of vector onto utility. And these individuals have this subjective belief distribution about have this subjective belief distribution about the occurrence of these events in the future, conditional on completing a given level of human capital. Okay. And the way to think about this is, in Mansky's framework, this would be something that would be called unresolvable uncertainty. So the idea is that individuals have to make a choice today. This uncertainty is not going to be realized till the very late, and they have to make this decision in the presence of this unresolvable uncertainty, opposed to resolvable uncertainty, which you can learn about before the timing of the decision. So what we're going to argue is by eliciting these distributions of these events at a given point in time, conditional on different levels of human capital, one can estimate the individual level ex-ante treatment effect. Okay, so to give you an example, for example, we can ask individuals, okay, if you were to go to college at age 30, and if you had gone to college at age 30, what do you think your earnings would be? Likewise, if you did not go to college, look ahead to when you would be 30 years old, what do you think your earnings would be? This is just an example, and from that that's what we'll call an individual level ex-ante treatment effect. And on the other hand, so how does this compare with data that we typically have? In the data, what we observe is, what we would want to know is, what would be the actual distribution of events that would occur if an individual actually chooses human capital level K. And typically, when we make an assumption of rational expectations, that's going to impose element by element that this distribution is equal to the subjective distribution. And as I mentioned, we can relax this assumption. So why does this matter? Typically, as liberal economists or applied econometricians, the object of interest is the ex post treatment effect, right? So what the individual's realization of X would be conditional on level K if the individual had chosen K versus if they had chosen K prime. So an example, for example, here would be the average treatment effect, right? But the problem is that for a given individual, we only observe one set of outcomes, right? We'll only observe their realizations for a given level of human capital investment. So if the individual goes to college, we will only observe their earnings. If they do go to college, we wouldn't observe their earnings if they had not gone to college. What we observe in the data is the ex post observed distribution is for people who optimally decide to get level K human capital. We observe their realizations, and we observe the realizations of people who optimally decide to get K prime level of human capital. And in order to, so the only instance where this would equal this is the object of interest here, right? The only instance where this would equal this is if selection were totally random, right? So typically the only data that we have tends to be these kinds of data, right? So we have to impose some assumptions on the selection process, some assumption about the ex-ante beliefs to get back at the object of interest. So in this paper, instead what we're going to do is we're going to elicit these beliefs ex-ante, like prior to the decision of human capital investment. We're going to elicit these beliefs for a large set of events conditional on different levels of human capital investments. So the events that we have in mind are, for example, expected earnings at different points in time, okay, over the life cycle, the likelihood of being married, fertility, spousal earnings, labor supply, and so on, conditional on different level of human capitals. So what are those levels in our context? So our sample is going to be college students, so students who have already decided to enroll in college. So the dimension that we're going to be looking at is the college major dimension, which is science versus humanities. We're going to collapse a lot of majors into these two broad categories versus no college. Like you go to college, but you drop out and you don't graduate with a degree, okay? And what we're going to do is, so once we have these data, we can then estimate these ex-ante treatment effects. So for example, we can see how does an individual perceive the likelihood of marriage depends on them going to college versus not going to college, okay? And in the last part of the paper, so the crux of the presentation is going to just show you actually these ex-ante treatment effects. So once you have the data, it's just showing you what the data looks like, okay? So that's, I hope to spend most of my time on that. But, okay, I'm sorry I've moved this, so they told me not to touch this. So. And I didn't think I touched it, but okay. So, sorry? Okay, so I'll keep talking. So, and then in the last part of the presentation, I'll even though that's not the main point of this paper here, because we've used these data in other cases to estimate these.
I need that for the review.
Sure. I'll be more careful.
Don't worry. Yeah, it's because of this.
Okay.
Well.
Okay. Sure. So, okay. So the main point of the presentation, I'll just go through these, describing what these ex-ante treatment effects look like, because that's the object of interest. But and we've used these data in other papers. I'll refer them very shortly to estimate these life cycle models of college major choice. That's not the goal here, but in the end, I'll show you that these ex-ante beliefs are actually predictive of intended choices.
You're going to compare what people
I'm not going to do that. So we don't have realizations for these people, right? These are college students. We're going to ask them about, for example, earnings at age 30 or age 45. These are 20-year-olds. What you can always do is, I have one slide here. We don't have a paper, but in the paper, I have one slide where I show you some statistics from the American Community Survey, where I show you that these realizations do differ across majors. The problem always, we don't have realizations for the same people. I can always compare it with realizations of previous cohorts, but then there are all these issues that you observe outcomes only for people who selected those fields and so on. So I can show you that they're not going to be totally crazy. I mean, they're going to be quite sensible, but there's no way of evaluating whether.
Because assume that those beliefs. Let's take the rational expectation story. Then, using this belief, you could get rid of the treatment versus, of the treatment effect of the problem that you're only observing.
Right.
And then you could see whether what you would predict using this belief
is what they actually, but we don't have the realizations for the same people.
Well, you can do the best prediction using
previous.
You have the past.
No, I think you can do something, but I am less. I think you would have to impose a lot of structure on something like that. Okay. No, I think
the rational expectation is they're using the best prediction available.
Sure.
You can certainly construct the best prediction available.
Sure.
An alternative way to do that, and it's not the ideal, but an alternative way to do what Pierre is asking about is you can ask, what are the realizations now?
Oh no, So I totally see what you're saying. So that is exactly what we've done in another paper. So the idea is, okay, it's my beliefs about what I think I will earn in the future that matter for my decision, but my beliefs about what I think I will earn, for example, let's say if I go to college, depend in part on my private information, but also in part on what I think an average graduate today makes, right? So we do elicit those beliefs that because then you can compare them with, you have actual.
Then you can do an incentive compatible design, which actually will.
Then you can, and that we've done elsewhere using the same sample. So I totally take the point. Okay. So that's what we're going to do in this paper. There's a big related literature, and I thought about it, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to be presenting this in a room where people have spent all their lives working on this area, so I better not put any references here in case I miss some. So people here have done a lot of work in this area, of course, especially I think the very first one, the human capital investments and returns in the marriage market. So it is tied in with that literature. It's also tied in with this literature on collecting subjective expectations data and using them for decision making under uncertainty. I think Mansky was one of the people who really pushed for this field, and there are people working in this area as well. And then it's of course related to this literature on college major choice and the gender gap. But I think the way where we are going to be slightly different is we're going to use these ex-ante beliefs to say something about how students perceive returns in the marriage market and family aspects when they're making these human capital investments. Okay. So, of course, to do that, given that existing data sets don't have this information, you have to go out and collect your own data. So in this case, what we're going to do, what we did is we collected these data at NYU. It's a selective private undergraduate institution. About 60% of our sample is going to be females. That's reflective of the gender composition at NYU. It's not going to be a random sample of students at NYU. The way this was done, the sample was recruited through the experimental lab at NYU. So those issues always, you should keep those in mind. The study was done in 2010, quite some time ago. And the data is going to be based on an online survey, which took about 90 minutes to complete. And students and they could take that survey anywhere. So once they signed up for the study, there was in the mail link, the survey link, and they could take it anywhere. And then there's no incentive compatibility. Like, we don't incentivize the responses. There was just a fixed compensation of $30 for completing the survey. But this survey is part of a much larger experiment that we did where we also give students information about, there was one question earlier about, you could ask students about what they think the current returns are to different majors and so on. So we actually did an experiment with these students, and we've written a bunch of papers with these data. Okay, so what we are going to do in this survey is, the idea is to collect data on life activities that we think are plausible determinants of college majors. Yeah.
Do you think the students in NYU would give you similar answer of students in Harvard?
At Harvard? Yeah, I think so. Okay, So
Because
it's
that's the effect of the school itself.
right. So I think these are selective schools, as I show you the sample, I'll show you some descriptive characteristics of the sample. They come from a very similar spectrum of the socioeconomic distribution. But I mean, there are school-specific factors always. For example, NYU does not have a strong, didn't really have an engineering school back then. I mean, so there are these school-specific factors which always matter. But I think qualitatively, this sample is very similar to a sample of undergraduates at any of the selective.
What about Kalamazoo Tech?
Sorry.
What about Kalamazoo Tech?
I
I care about Harvard. I care about the people at Kalamazoo Tech. I care about the people in California. I care about doing.
I don't know what the criteria is for who we should care about, but I think the point that we are going. So, I think we agree. If we agree that these data are useful to collect, then you can only do that. It's hard to scale these up. I'm not saying no one should scale these up. We did this at NYU because it was convenient. My co-author was at NYU. Whether responses would be different at Kalamazoo Tech,
Well,
sure.
I guess the issue is, whether it's the top 1 or 2% of the ability distribution.
Yeah.
So that, that in some sense defines
Right.
what we care about, because
Right.
it's a very, one needs to motivate why
Right.
one wants to go to the super elite type.
Right. So I think the way, sure, I know, I understand where these questions are coming from. I think the way we think about this is, okay, when we collect these data from these very high ability samples, if these things, these family considerations and so on, show up even in this very high ability sample, I think the likelihood of these factors mattering in these other less selective populations is even higher, I think. So I mean, that's how we think about it, okay? So what we are going to do is we're going to collect data on a bunch of consequential life activities conditional on the choice of majors. Of course, NYU, any school offers a lot of majors. We're going to collapse them to 5 broad major categories. So students were asked their beliefs about, I'll show you the questions, conditional on these different 5 major categories. So the categories were business, engineering, humanities, natural sciences, and not graduate, okay? That is, you don't graduate with a degree. So it's conditional on each of these majors. Then students were asked about these different events in the future at 3 different ages: at age 22, at age 30, and at age 45. And the things that we asked about are things like future earnings, expected earnings. We also asked about earnings uncertainty, the likelihood of being married, the number of children, spouses' earnings, labor supply, and so on. Okay. And we also collected data from the students on the probability that they believe that they would graduate from each of these majors, okay, from NYU. Yeah.
You also asked them about their certainty of the expected future earnings?
Yeah, so that's what I said. I'm not going to show you anything about that, but we also, so a lot of what I'm going to show you are going to be point estimates, but for things like earnings, we actually elicit the entire subjective distribution.
And the question on
Yeah.
earnings was kind of conditional on working?
Yeah, so I'll show you a couple of questions. I won't show you all of them. Maybe it's the next slide. No, it's a couple of slides. Let me get to that, okay? Okay, and then ask me if it's not clear, okay? So the descriptive statistics, so this is the NYU sample. As I mentioned, this is a very, very high ability sample. If you look at the SAT scores, these are in the 90th, above the 90th percentile of the US population. If you look at parents' income, it's $150,000. So this puts them at the very high end of the income distribution, which is expected. This is most of them were we tried to target students who were earlier on in their educational careers. So most of them are freshmen and sophomores, because the idea is that, okay, you're not committed to a major, you still can choose between majors. And then this is the likelihood that they assign to graduating with each of these majors. So this is, for example, something that you'll also see in other representative data sets, that men are more than twice as likely as women to major in economics, but women are almost twice as likely as men to major in humanities. This is something that you see in other data sets as well. Okay, so I'll just show you a couple of sample questions. So here, the way we ask about earnings is, okay, conditional on you majoring in each of those major categories, look ahead to when you are 30 years old and you are working full-time. What do you think your average earnings would be? So we actually in the survey defined what full-time meant. We also, because we're going to be asking about earnings at different points over the life cycle, we told them not to worry about inflation. So think about so that's what we did here. Another example, so how we get at spousal earnings. Again, so we'll elicit a lot of these marginal beliefs as well. But we say, okay, consider the case when you're 30 years old and you're married and your spouse is working full time. Okay, so it's already, then what do you think your spouse's earnings would be if you yourself major in each of these majors? Okay, so that's the return that the individual perceives to the spousal quality conditional on their major. Okay.
Did you ask them if they already had a partner?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. And then the question, so there are a lot of questions like that. And then we ask them, what do you believe is the percent chance? This is how we elicit the stated choice here of college major. Okay. So as I said, I just have one slide. I'm not going to come back to this really later. So this is just using the American Community Survey, the 2009 data. If you look at the major composition conditional on going to college, is something that you see over there as well, that there's a big, males are much more likely to be measuring in science, females are much more likely to be measuring in humanities. This is something well known. If you don't condition on college majors, the same patterns appear. The one thing I think this is pretty well known to this audience is that women in the US have overtaken for quite some time men in terms of college enrollment and college completion. And then you can see, I mean, this is where I'm just showing you some statistics about average earnings, about marriage, about full-time employment. This is where selection and all these things come in. So, but this is what you see in the data, okay? And this is what like the realizations distribution, the H distribution, which I put up earlier on would be. Like this is the observed data for people who optimally chose to make that decision, okay? I'm not going to come back to that, but in the paper we do some comparisons. Okay, I'll start out with beliefs about earnings. Later on, I'll just show you this one slide which has a lot of numbers, and then I'll jump to these ex-ante treatment effects. Okay, so what I'm showing you in this table is these individuals' beliefs in thousands of dollars, or what they think they would be earning at these different ages if they graduated with a science degree, a humanities degree, if they did not graduate. So if you recall, I started out with 5 categories, right? So we had business, economics, we had engineering, we had natural sciences, we had humanities. We collapsed a lot of them into science. So basically what I'll be doing in the presentation is the returns to going to college versus not going to college, and then the difference between science and humanities. Okay, but you can look at by subcategory as well, but I think that's where the most interesting.
Economics is in science.
Economics is in science. Yeah, it is in science. Yeah, it is. It is in science. Yeah. So, so if you look at the relative rankings here, so if, it is true in the observational data as well that graduates who graduate with science, they have much higher average earnings than those in humanities. Humanities graduates have higher earnings than those who are not graduate. What is interesting is the earnings profile over the life cycle. So there's going from age 22 to age 30, individuals perceive a huge earnings growth if they were to graduate in science. So they more than double in the case, they almost double for both males and females. For humanities, there's growth, but less. The same thing I can show you on the next slide. So what I'm showing you here is average earnings, beliefs about earnings growth. We only have 3 points in time, right? Age 22, age 30, and age 45. So you can see that both males and females perceive a much higher earnings growth in business science versus humanities or the not graduate category. Okay, so, yeah.
So for women, so the question is the same for men and women, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But is there any way to capture if women perceive that there's going to be interruptions? So the question is about 30, working full time at 30, but do you tell them also, assuming you work full time all the way to 30?
No, we don't say anything about between now and age 30. We, for example,
because it's much lower, right, for women?
Oh, it is lower, but it's lower also in observational data as well. How much? Yeah. I mean, we don't tell them. So the idea is when we elicit these expectations, whether it's earnings or any of these other things, we're letting the individuals do that optimization problem. Exactly, and we tell them to take into account like things like going to graduate school, for example, right? So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, but like when we estimate this, so we've used these data to estimate proper models of choice models of college majors. They will take into account all these things about labor supply and so on. Okay. Okay. So in the rest, what I'm going to do in the next set of slides is instead of showing you those numbers by majors, what I'm going to show you is how we construct this ex-ante treatment effect. So it's just going to be the log odds of that variable given human capital level k versus k prime. Okay, so we're going to construct 2 differences here. So in one case, we're going to look at the so let's say we're looking at earnings. So we're going to look at earnings that the individual perceives in science versus humanities. So that's going to be the first ex-ante treatment effect. So that's the treatment effect of me going from choosing a science major versus a non-science major. So that's the intensive margin, okay? And the other one that we're going to look at is we're going to take a weighted average of all these earnings and all these outcomes by college majors. So you know what the, like let's say earnings will be if I go to college, and we're going to compare them with the no degree case. Okay, so that's the returns, the ex-ante treatment effect of a college degree per se, okay? So that's, those are the kinds of numbers that I'll be showing you. So this is just the level that these individuals perceive. So this I already showed you on an earlier slide. For example, that at age 30, an average male thinks that they're going to be making $129,000. Women think they're going to be making $92,000. This is, of course, in part driven by the college major, right, that they're choosing. In the bottom panel here, I'm showing you these ex-ante treatment effects. So what this is telling you, for example, that the individuals think that if they graduate with a major versus not a major, for example, at age 30, their earnings are going to be 100% higher. Okay, twice that if they graduate with a degree versus not a degree. So they're going to be 100. Like at age 45, it's about 80% higher. Okay, even at age 22, it's about 60% higher, both for males and females. On the other hand, in the case of science versus humanities, so these are actually all significant. All these estimates are significant. I'm not putting stars here. So I'm just showing you the average estimates here. So if they get a, so this is again where the intensive margin comes in. Whether I get a science degree versus a humanities degree, they think at age 30 their earnings would be, an individual thinks if they were to major in science versus humanities, on average their earnings would be 50% higher. Okay. These are quite large. This is, as I mentioned, these are just averages. We can compute these ex-ante returns at the individual level. So what I'm showing you here are the male and the female distributions for the expected log return for a degree versus no college degree. So you can see all the distribution. Everyone, the returns vary from about 10% higher to about 150% higher. Yes.
Sir, quick question. Do you ever compare these beliefs to what is the realized?
Yeah, so that's what Pirandra's question was as well. These are students who are still in college. We don't know their realizations. What we can do is we can compare them for previous cohorts. So, okay, I can tell you if you look at the college premium in the U.S., for example, just looking at earnings of graduates versus not graduates, they're about 70% higher. Okay, so that for an average person out there in the population. This, of course, is not. This sample is not a random sample of the U.S. population.
Because I was thinking maybe a gender comparison, or also that it could be that some people are just more informed or better or know better because maybe their parents are just in the same profession, or maybe a gender thing. Maybe girls are more mature on average than boys, so maybe they're more informed. So do you see some patterns?
So what we do, I'm not going to show you here, is we know what their intended major is, right? So what you can do is, okay, let's say people who intend to major in engineering, for example, are their earnings distribution any different from those who are not in? But then, of course, that's where selection and all these other things come in, right? Where there should be difference if people are sorting into these majors. The point I think I would want you to take away from here is like, okay, this is what the distribution looks like. The US one is somewhere in here. So these are not crazy numbers. I think the issue then goes back to how well informed they are. I think that's a totally relevant question when we want to, for a policy point of view, right? I think what the stand that we're taking here is, okay, these are as long as individuals are reporting their true beliefs here, and I'll show you evidence that these beliefs do matter for the major that they choose, then these are interesting objects of interest. Then the question that you raised that has come up is there are rooms for policy interventions if these beliefs are biased in a systematic way. And that's what we have done in other contexts, yes.
So what would be the cause for no graduate in their mind? So are they thinking they might be failing, or they? We
don't say anything, right? I mean, that's up. So the idea is, okay, if you don't graduate, whatever the reason is, we let them figure that out, what they think the earnings would be. We don't have to take a stand on that because we're letting them do the optimization there. Okay. And then on the right-hand side, you see the returns, the perceived returns distribution for a science versus a non-science major. So here there is some people who think they'll actually be worse off, right, if they go to science, which makes people have different skills. But like the vast majority of respondents, actually, it's surprising how large the distribution of respondents is who think that their returns would be higher if they went to science versus non-science, both for males and females. Okay, so now I'm going to go through different outcomes one at a time. So if you look at labor force participation, so here we're going to ask, we ask them like the likelihood that they'll be working full-time, part-time, and they won't be working at different ages. So for example, at age 30, you can see males, it's an 82% likelihood versus 76 for females, so there's a gap. At later ages, there's less of a gap, okay? So one thing which I should mention is when we look at these beliefs, we don't know whether this is voluntary or involuntary, right? So, and that's something we can't distinguish between, right? The individuals want to work, but they can't get whether this includes their beliefs about not being able to get a full-time job versus voluntarily deciding that they don't want to work full-time. So and that's something we can't distinguish with these data. Okay, so the lower panel here is showing again the ex-ante treatment effects. So here you can see that at age 30, what these individuals think that the likelihood of working full-time if they graduate versus not graduate is 30 to 40% higher. Okay. On the other hand, and then what is interesting is even conditional on a college degree, the likelihood differs by whether they think they will have a science degree versus a humanities degree. The gaps are less. The differences are less stark at later ages. Interestingly, okay.
You know, it would be interesting if you would ask them what's the likelihood of you working as a physicist,
right,
as an economist,
right.
It's not just if you're working or not.
Right. So it's working condition. No, I see what you're saying. It's working conditional. So this is unconditional here, but we also have, this is constructed from the conditional probabilities that they report for each of the majors. We don't know what they would be working as conditional on each major. So there could be, right. That, right. Yeah.
Some expectation.
Right. Right.
We too many lawyers.
Right.
It's likely to be
right.
lawyers.
Right. So conditional, I totally see what you're saying. Conditional on, we only elicit these beliefs conditional on major, but we're not eliciting the industry or the occupation that they have in mind. Yeah. Okay. So beliefs about marriage. Okay. So this is, first let's look at the average levels. So you can see that the average likelihood that they report to being married at age 23 is 16 and 18, not much of a difference by gender. Women assign, there seems to be a timing thing here where at age 30 they assign a higher likelihood to be being married. This is again average, there's a lot of heterogeneity. At age 45 there's similar likelihood of being married, it's about 80% for both males and females. So looking at the treatment effects here, so and again, so there are two things here, right? So you may invest in human capital to make yourself more attractive, that will increase your chances in the labor market, but at the same time, if you have a college degree, you have higher earnings, so the earnings of a spouse would be less valuable. So there are these two effects that are going to be going on here, right? And we can't really distinguish between them here. So if you see, let's look at the last row here, like graduate versus no graduate. At age 23, it's actually very interesting. Females assign a much higher likelihood to be married if they don't graduate versus they graduate. And at other ages, both men and women, they assign a 13 to 30% higher likelihood of being married.
That kind of reflects also behavior, right?
Yeah, that's what I said. Like there are two things here, right? So like if I have a college degree, then the earnings of my spouse are less valuable, so I may choose not to get married, versus the other thing where I'm more attractive in the labor market. So there are these two, it affects behavior, right? So
are you looking at who they get married to?
I'll show you a slide, yeah. That's the next slide. So, and again, versus science versus humanities, I think again, there is something going on where females think there's a 15% lower likelihood of being married at age 30. At age 45, that's if they major in science versus humanities. Sorry?
That's what they expect about age of marriage. So
right.
they expect to be more likely to be married.
Right.
But
Right.
to be less likely to be married.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Do you ever race nationality and religion?
So race this is going to be, we have it, we're not controlling for that here. We have that, yeah. Nationality we have, yeah. Yeah.
And any difference between?
Race, this is mostly going to be a white or Asian sample.
Yeah.
So, I mean, by Asians, I can cut the sample a few ways, but I can't cut it by minority status. Yeah, I mean, there are these covariates. I'm just showing you unconditional stuff here. We can do some cuts, of course, yeah. Okay, so this goes, now I'm going to show you a couple of slides about spouse quality. Before I get to the spousal earnings, So we asked these students if they major in science, humanities, or not graduate, what do they think the major of their spouse would be? So if I major in science, so this is for males and females, they're actually very similar, so you can look at either. So on average, the likelihood of, if I major in science, the likelihood that my spouse also has a science degree is 70%. It's not as assortative here as I thought it would be. For humanities, it's also 55, it's much higher for science. For not graduate, the higher, there's a likelihood of a third that if I don't graduate, my spouse would also, yeah.
So you were mentioning that you look at these measures as a measure of spouse quality. So for the major, I'm wondering, whether...
No, the next one is going to be the earnings is what I'll call spouse.
Now, even for earnings.
Right.
The problem is that the earnings are, depend on the labor supply choice.
Right.
It's clearly like a joint choice.
Sure.
So it could mean that, there's like a woman, right, who finds a very high earning spouse because of the major, and then actually decides to stay home, right?
Yeah,
so you would it would look as if, the spouse quality is low, let's say, but it's just because,
So, I totally get your point. I think maybe I should not use the word spouse quality. It just beliefs about spousal earnings. If the spouse worked full time, that's what the point well taken. Yes.
In all this, could you do the analysis separate for like people who doesn't have a partner? I mean, to separate.
Right. Sure. We could do that. Sure. We could do that. Yes.
How would this map onto Aloysius's accounting identities? Like, there's not enough science grads to go around.
Right. Yeah. No, that's true. Yeah, no, that's true.
Optimistic beliefs.
Yeah, optimistic beliefs, or Okay, so let me quickly show what they think. So these are condition. I'm showing you the average earnings weighted by the probability that they think they'll major in these different majors. So let's go to age 30, for example. Males think that on average their spouses will be making $84,000. This is unconditional. Females think it's about $97,000. What is interesting is when you compare this to their self-earnings, this is conditional on working full-time, right? So females actually think their spouses would be earning more. So I think this is just the gender gap this is also being driven by my own earnings and what I think by my own major, and as well as what I think my spouse's majors would be. Okay.
But so I'm just trying to understand this. So if you're female,
right,
do they actually think that their husbands are going to earn more?
That's what they think on average. Yes. On average, they think their spouse would earn $97,000 and they would earn $92,000.
97 compared to what the men think they would earn.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No. So whether that is different, it is. I think.
The men think they earn much more than the women think they would earn.
Right. So it's not necessarily that this sample is all going to marry each other, right? So, there are many reasons why they don't have to match up, right? It could be that they have genuinely optimistic expectations, but there could be a lot of other things going on.
What's the proportion of students enrolled in sciences versus humanities? Or you might have before, maybe I missed.
A question about what?
The majors. What proportion of students?
Oh, so those were the probability. Yeah. So these are students. There's no tracking earlier on, right? So these are students who can still have time to declare their major, but not this one. These are the likelihood of choosing these different majors. So if you can see the mean likelihood of choosing economics is the modal major for males, humanities is the modal major for females. There's quite a bit of variation. Okay. Okay. I can't move this up.
There's more people in humanities than in science.
No, in terms of these are expectations, right? The likelihood that.
I just want to know what proportion is in humanities and what proportion.
In this sample, not all of them have declared their major, right? So these are students who are in the freshman or sophomore year predominantly.
When they get, what's the graduate?
Oh, so the graduate, it would be very similar to, it's quite similar to this. Actually, I've looked at that. If you pull the major composition of graduates of similar cohorts, it's very, very similar to this.
Yeah, I'm just working out if there really are enough science people.
Yeah, okay, sure. Sure. Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question on the gender gap? Because it seems that women strongly underestimate the gender gap from those two numbers.
How are you making that inference?
The 9.7 over 9.2, that's the right thing that I have to look at or not?
This what they think. This is, what they think their spouse would make. This is.
So essentially, they think that the gender gap is very small, right?
This is not the. this is, I think if you want to see what they think that gender gap is, you want to ask them what they think an average male graduate makes, what an average female graduate makes. Because, yeah, that's all sorting. So that we have data. I'm not showing you here. Okay, I have 10 minutes and I have a lot to go through. So, okay, so yes. So average log, so this is the returns, what they think the earnings, how much higher their earnings, spouses' earnings would be. If they graduate versus not graduate, so here you can see, yeah, this works. So on average, both males and females think if they graduate, their spouses' earnings would be about 70% higher versus if they don't graduate. Conditional on college degree, again, there's about a 30% premium if they think if this is their own major, right? If I major in science, then what I think my spouse's earnings would be, right? So that's the return to the major dimension here. So this is conditional labor supply. So we asked individuals. I thought this was very interesting that conditional on being married as well as being single. This is unconditional on major here. So we're weighting it by major. What is the likelihood that they would be working full-time, part-time, and not working? What is very interesting for men, it doesn't. The conditional likelihoods of labor supply are very similar, whether they're married or single. But for females, there's a big difference here. So if for example, if you look at this is at age 30, by the way. So if you look at the likelihood that they would be working full-time, it's about 10 percentage points lower on average if they're married versus single. So a lot of this is choice and so on. Okay, there's fertility. Okay, I can go through it, I think. Okay, so we then ask them, again, I'm just showing you first, this is by weighting by the likelihood that they assign to different majors. What is the expected number of children they expect to have at age 30? So here you can again see there's a timing thing going on where females at age 30, there's on average expect to have more kids. By age 45, the expectation for both genders is very similar. So now looking at what the returns are, at age 30, if they don't graduate, if they graduate versus not graduate, they think they'll have about 70 to 80% increase in the expected number of kids.
Can you expect to have fewer children if you're a woman at 45 than at 30?
I think we have some outliers. I don't know what happened. Yeah, I don't. So the way this is done is we don't ask for a point estimate. We ask for a density, actually. We ask like the likelihood that they'll have 0, 1. So I think there in some responses, yeah, I have to go back in the data. It shouldn't be there. Yeah. Okay.
Surviving children.
Okay. So, but versus science versus humanities, again, you can see at age 30, actually, they expect to have fewer kids if they get a science degree versus a non-humanities degree. But at age 45, they expect to have more kids, right? So there's something about timing here, as well as like this income trade-off, possibly that at age 45, they're more than caught up, right? They're having more kids.
Do you expect whether they expect to do a master's degree and things like that? It might be more common in science.
Right, right. So we don't. I don't think in the survey we asked this question about whether they expect to do it. When we asked them to report these beliefs about especially earnings, we told them to take those things into account. So they're presumably taking these things into account, but I have to think if in the survey we asked them, because it would be good to know whether this is where it is coming from. I don't think we did, but I'll have to check, okay? Okay, so in the last few minutes, even though that's not the main point of what we're trying to do here, because as I mentioned, we've used these data in other contexts, but I just want to show you some very, very reduced form evidence that, okay, all these beliefs that I've shown you, they do matter, right? Because it's interesting, but if these beliefs don't matter for intended or actual choices, they're not very useful, right? So this is the mean likelihood that these individuals assign to majoring in these different majors. For science, for males, it's about 67%. For females, it's 48%. For humanities, it's about 30% for males and almost 50% for females. So what we're going to do, this is a very, very reduced form model. Elsewhere, we've estimated some more realistic models. Here, the way to think about this is very reduced form. I just want to show you that these beliefs are predictive of actual major choice. So let's assume a very simple linear model, which is additive in these expectations of these outcomes. And then there's this error term, which is resolvable uncertainty. I'm going to assume that utility is linear and separable in these outcomes. And it's going to be, the individual is going to get utility from discounted lifetime own earnings. So I only showed you earnings at age 30 and age 45. Given their earnings at different points over the life cycle, we can estimate the individual's entire life cycle earnings profile. And then we can see what their earnings would be at each point in time. We have data on there, how many hours they expect to work. okay, and whether they expect to work full time. So basically you can take into account their labor supply and everything here. So this is their discounted lifetime expected earnings. We're going to also look at discounted lifetime expected spouses earnings. So this is reduced form. This is probably not the right way to do this, but we are going to additively put in these terms in there, like the likelihood of being married at age 30, at age 45, the expected number of children, your perceived ability, and so on. We're going to assume it's type 1 extreme value distribution. It's a simple logic. You apply because we have the probabilities that they're assigned to these different majors. You just take the log odds. You assume that the rounding has some parametric symmetric distribution around conditional on the x's, so it's just a simple OLS, okay, if you buy this. And again, this is, I don't necessarily believe this model. This is just to show you that whether these beliefs matter or not. So when you look at this, you can see that, do I have any? Okay, so you can see that so for males and females, we estimate this separately. Your own lifetime earnings matter quite a bit. If you look at spousal stuff, spouses' lifetime earnings seem to matter for females. This again, as I said, we just entering this in a super reduced form way, and this is probably not the right way to do this, but if you look at like the probability that they're assigned to marriage as well as expected number of kids, some of these things are showing up. I'll show you decomposition to make you.
I didn't understand what the dependent variable is.
The dependent variable is the probability that they're assigned to major K versus K prime. So it's just a log odds. So there are three majors: humanities, science, and not graduate. Okay. So maybe it will become clear here what we're doing. So the estimates that we get there. Okay, let's assume that that's the right model of major choice. Let's start out with a baseline case where I assign the same beliefs to everyone for all the x's across the majors, okay? Or you can start out with a case where everyone has the same beliefs about these x's as in humanities, so there's equal likelihood of choosing each of these majors. Now let me go in and put in the earnings for that major. So what you can see is that for both genders, the mean likelihood jumps up for science because your earnings are higher in science and individuals like higher earnings. For humanities, it goes down a little bit. For not graduate, it goes down quite a bit. Then I add in ability. What happens is because science is perceived to be a harder field, there's a drop in the mean the likelihood of choosing science. It goes up slightly for humanities and then for the not graduate category. I think the interesting stuff is when you put in marriage as well as spousal earnings, what is really striking is that there's a big drop in the mean likelihood of not graduating. So the lower panel is just showing you translating these numbers into percent changes from the previous column. Okay, so the mean likelihood is dropping by 16 to 32 percent for both genders. There's a slight drop for males for humanities, but there's a big increase for females for both majors and for males, especially for science. And then you go in and then put in fertility. There you see there's a big shift towards humanities. Okay, so we take this as evidence that this again was very super reduced form, and that was not the point of this paper. But the point is that these beliefs do seem to matter for intended choices.
So what story do you have in mind for the marriage market, for the causal effect of like the field to the marriage market? So is it that you think you meet different people when you, depending on your major in the field, let's say, or you have higher labor market potential and that makes it more attractive? I mean, what are...
We can't really distinguish between that. That's what in the end what we get is one number from right? I don't think we can really distinguish those two explanations. Definitely not with the data that we have. I'm trying to think if elsewhere when we've used these data to estimate a more realistic model, we haven't really tried to distinguish that. And I'm trying to think if possibly with more structure we could do that, and I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that, yes.
Here you're relating their belief about the outcome to their belief about what they're going to do.
Yes.
Is there any way you could relate their belief about the outcome
to what they
actually do?
Yeah, so I think with that we can do that. I think we have to go back and get these data from them. So that
would be fascinating.
Right, that we can.
You could say, they're a misperception at some point, and then when it comes.
But I think what I can tell you is so these data were collected in 2010. In 2012, we went back to a subset of this sample, and there's persistence in what they intended to do. So what if those who had said they're doing engineering or economics, the vast majority of them were still doing that. So, but I can bring that in. We didn't go back to everyone. We only went back to a subset. But I think that we do have evidence that there's a strong relationship between what they intend to do and what they actually do.
The reason why I'm raising, we have time.
Yeah, sure.
the reason why I'm raising this is there is a number of people in this room who have been arguing that when we look at the return to the investment into higher education, in general, people concentrate on the return you get on the labor market, but there is a very important aspect, which is the return you get on the marriage market, which has been largely under considered until recently. And your data go exactly in this direction.
Right, exactly, right.
So the only problem I have with this is that it's what people are telling you that they think they're going to do.
Right.
And it would be even more convincing if instead of this, we had what people actually did.
Right. No, I think we can get data on what they actually majored in. That we can definitely do.
Whether they dropped out.
Yeah, that we can. That we can definitely do. But I think that we can do. Okay. I think I'm done actually. So I mean, in conclusion, I think I've shown you that it is the case that students do perceive very different returns to human capital investments in both the labor and marriage market, in the sense that the returns tend to differ by graduating versus not graduating, by college majors. There's a lot of heterogeneity in these ex-ante beliefs. We think these beliefs, we have actually used these beliefs in elsewhere in life cycle models of human capital investments, but I think these beliefs, you can collect them, you can use them in association with other data, but I think these can be helpful in estimating human capital investment decisions. And I've shown some reduced form evidence that these beliefs seem to matter in explaining what they intend to do.
How did GPA, when you condition it, you don't condition a GPA, how much does GPA explain of the variation in beliefs?
In beliefs, so about earnings, so GPA is not...
GPA even about, earnings or major or anything.
Right. The thing is, GPA is very major specific. So let's take SAT scores, right? SAT scores, right? I mean, when you do these regressions to explain how much of these cross-sectional variation in these beliefs can be explained by covariates, it's very, very low. It's very, very low, right? So it's...
Do you list things on what the parents do or no?
Yes, we do have some information about the parents' profession, yeah.
But it still doesn't explain very much.
No, so that's what. So when I said it's very low, it's putting in measures of ability, parental background, parental field of study. I mean, whether they went to college or not, and things like that. So the R-squared in these regressions tends to be quite low.
So where do you think the variation is coming from? This variation in beliefs.
I mean, it's hard to tell, but there's a lot of private information that is not being captured by the observables that we have on these people. And we have a fairly decent set of observables. It's not that...
You were thinking about it.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment and a question on PA, a comment for PA. One of the great things about this research and similar work is the eliciting the whole distribution. So it's not just the point estimate of returns, you've got a sense of the expected variability.
Right.
And my second question is the following. Couldn't you, I'm all into sort of testing, you're asserting that these things have predictive power. What if you did the following? You ask the people right now, what do you think the difference is between salaries that people are doing in this area and that area? And what if those people are completely off?
Right.
Would you still assert that their beliefs about what's going to happen in 10, 15 years have any credibility whatsoever if they don't know the differences right now?
So I think, so the first question about, I just showed you a lot of stuff on point estimates. I think there was a question earlier whether we elicit earnings uncertainty and things like that. We actually do. I didn't put up those statistics here. The second question is we do exactly what you said, where we ask people, look at current graduates now who majored in engineering, economics, and humanities. Tell us what you think their earnings are. Right, so this is exactly what we did exactly. So that's what when I put up earlier that we did this experiment with students where we asked them exactly this, and then we actually tell them the distribution of earnings in the population, and then we see how their choices change. So we have data on how well aware they are about the objective returns to these things. The question is, if someone is totally clueless, what does that mean? Can we take the beliefs here to explain their choices or not? I still think we can if these are the beliefs that they're acting on when they're making the choices. It opens up this other question of, then that raises a question about that there's room for policy interventions where you give them this information about objective returns, that there's this bias in their beliefs, right?
Yeah, I'm just trying to make the methodological point that people keep asking, how do we know that these are the true beliefs that people have? We've done work to take one in your area where we asked them, can you tell me the actual inflation rate last year? They get that wrong. If I then ask them a hypothetical survey question and PA doesn't know the current inflation rate, What chance in heck does he have of having a reasonable expectation?
No,
now,
I
might
think
still be the one he acts on.
Right.
But I think we need these basic calibrating.
No, I understand the point, and I think we're saying the same things, but I'm not sure. I'll catch up with you later. But I think I see what you're saying.
Thank you very much.
Okay.